OK，大家好，今天我很开心，因为我们要开始讲新的题目，是关于平等。平等是非常非常重要的题目，对不对？但是平等和等级的关系是什么？我们会讨论。但是我们先讲平等，然后19世纪最伟大的哲学家就是讨论平等的哲学家。当然是马克思 Karl Marx， 对不对？20世纪的最伟大的哲学家，就是关于平等方面的哲学家，是 John Rawls 罗尔斯。而且更有意思的，很多人不知道 ，Rawls 直接受到马克思的影响，因为很多人觉得 Rawls 他是自由主义者，当然马克思是共产主义者。但是，他们讲关于平等的问题，有时候，尤其是关于我们会看the natural endowments 的问题 ，Rawls 直接受到马克思的影响。所以今天我们先讨论马克思，然后讨论 Rawls， 因为是西方的学者，所以大部分我用英文来讲，好吗？你们当然都学过一些马克思，对不对？是吗 ？OK， 但是我不知道你们怎么学过。我怎么学过呢？我读硕士和博士是在牛津大学，然后那时候我跟 G.A. Cohen 学过马克思理论。G.A. Cohen 是很出名的学者，他写了一本书 ，in English it's called Karl Marx's Theory of History， 也有中文版，是吗？你看过吗？但是你知道那个名字对不对 ？In Chinese, Karl Marx Theory of History 应该是马克思的历史理论，反正有中文版。这本书非常有意思，因为他讲得很清楚什么是 It's called and then the 副标题 is a defense. So he is a Marxist. He defends Karl Marx's theory of history.而且我觉得也还挺有意思，他的老家是 Montreal 也是我的老家。Anyway， 所以我在牛津学的马克思主义，所以我们先讲马克思主义。当然我受到主要是G.A. Cohen 的影响，但是 G.A. Cohen 的目标就是为了讲清楚马克思本人的思想是什么。OK， 所以So let's discuss Karl Marx, his own views.Especially his views on economic justice and equality, okay? Many people think that Karl Marx views himself as a scientist, 是科学家，他不讨论道德的问题，其实没有那么简单，对不对？ In reality, Karl Marx himself was not just a theorist, he was an activist.He was actively involved in defending workers' rights in his day, right? Why did he do that? The main reason is because he thought capitalism was fundamentally unjust, okay? 是非正义的。And he had a moral criticism of capitalism. He thought it's bad, and we should try to overcome capitalism as soon as possible so that we could move on.to communism, right? Of course, he thinks communism is better than capitalism from a moral point of view. Okay? But why does he think that? Why? Let's look at that. It has mainly to do with the ideal of equality, okay? First, let's look at why he thinks capitalism is a problem. 为什么资本主义是不好的东西？第一个理由，因为 capitalism 有虚假的意识 it promotes a kind of false consciousness. What's the main form of false consciousness? False consciousness is a belief you have that is wrong, okay? To use modern language, it's like fake news, okay? What do people think? What's wrong? What are the wrong ideas generated by capitalism? Well, the main wrong idea is the idea that what matters is the promotion of civil and political rights. 公民与政治权利. Once we have those rights, for example, as secured in the American Constitution, then that is sufficient for human welfare. 人类福祉，我们就需要一些自由，尤其是公民自由和政治自由，其他没有那么重要 ，OK？ And in fact, freedom is not important. He makes a point which is made all the time by people on the political left. Socialists, left liberals, communists all agree on this idea that you can have formal freedom, legal freedom, but it's empty freedom, so long as you do not have material resources to make those freedoms meaningful. 自由需要物质的基础, okay? If I have the freedom to travel, but I have no money to travel, it's an empty freedom, right? If I have the freedom of speech, but in fact, only wealthy capitalists can promote their views in an effective way through the media ownership, then it's not a very meaningful freedom. If I have the freedom to vote, but in fact, the capitalists control the political process, and my vote makes no practical difference, then that freedom is not meaningful, right? If I have the freedom to work and to find my job, but in fact, only terrible, mind-dulling, and dirty and dangerous jobs are available, then it's not a meaningful freedom if I'm not born in a wealthy family. Freedom needs a material basis to be meaningful. That's his main point. It's very early on in Karl Marx, in his early works, and it's one that he never abandons, and one that has huge influence in the subsequent socialist and communist tradition, okay? But in many cases, in Western countries, including the US, people think all I need is freedom, and that's fine, right? I told you already, there's in New Hampshire, there's a 车牌, 那个口号是 live free or die. No, it's very clear, right? All I need is freedom, otherwise my life is not meaningful. Well, of course, Karl Marx's view is different. You have to look at how resources are distributed, especially how property rights are distributed. If I'm born into a family that does not have property or capital, it's very hard for me to have an equal starting point in life, okay? There's a very famous now economist, 可能你们知道, his name is Thomas Piketty. 他中文的名字你们知道吗？是法国的学者，他写了一本书，Capital 资本论。你说声音大一点。对，是21世纪资本论。Oh yeah, Capital of the 21st Century. Yes. He is directly influenced by Karl Marx, and he makes this point that if you're not born into a family with capital, you start out in a very unequal position, and it's bound to get more and more unequal over time. The problem is capitalism, especially the way that it distributes property. But most people don't know that. So it's a kind of false consciousness. It's a kind of 虚假的意识. Okay, 大部分人不知道是这个问题. Okay? So Karl Marx wrote his books to show the reality. Another thing that's wrong with capitalism. 资本主义有什么问题？第二个问题也很清楚。Workers are alienated. 劳动者被异化。What does that mean, alienated? 你们学过吗？ It's a very young Karl Marx, when he was in his 20s, he wrote the economic and philosophical manuscripts. 中文怎么说？声音大一点。手稿，你们对手稿，你们读过吗？你们读过关于 Karl Marx and 为什么劳动者被异化呢？你们学过一些？ It's actually not very complicated issue. For Karl Marx, he has a view of human nature. What makes us different than animals? 我们跟动物有什么不一样？最关键的是 we have the capacity for creative work. 人类的本质就是创造性劳动，创造性劳动的能力。An animal does not have the capacity to imagine a building and build a building. 今天有中国在北京有新的机场，哇，非常漂亮，很有创造性，对不对？人类才可以这么做，对不对？动物它没有这样的想象，they don't have that imagination, okay? Only humans can have an idea and create a beautiful work of art. Only humans have the capacity to take notes and write an article or write a book. This is what makes us distinctly human, is our capacity for creative work. Okay? The problem with capitalism is that for the large majority of people, of workers, they do not exercise creative work. Most workers, imagine factories in parts of China. Most workers do very simple, repetitive work, right? 没有什么创造性，对不对？ Capitalism does not value creativity. Capitalists who own the means of production, 生产资料，对不对？ They don't care about making the workers creative. All they care about is profit, right? They just want to make money. And they put workers in very dirty, dangerous, repetitive, and boring jobs. Most workers in capitalist societies are stuck in those boring jobs. So in this sense, they're alienated, 被异化, from the capacity for creative work, okay? This is a huge problem of capitalism. Only communism can overcome that. That's what we're going to see, okay? And China is a communist society. In theory, we can and should move towards this ideal where most people have the capacity and the ability to engage in creative work. That's the moral point of the whole thing, okay? We're also alienated from the work process, 劳动过程. What does that mean? That means that when I go to work, Karl Marx, it's in the passage that I asked you to read, he regarded most workers regard work as a means to life, not as life's prime want. 理论上，我们工作应该是我们生活的最基本的需要，理论上, in theory, right? Work should be, when I go to work, I should be so happy. And that's where I develop my ability for creative work. But in reality, most workers in capitalist societies, they regard work as necessary for life. 是生活的手段，而不是目标, okay? If you speak to workers in factories, you ask them, why do they work? 你们可以去, 深圳这些地方有很多工厂，你问这些工人，你为什么上班？他说为了赚钱。为什么要赚钱呢？因为我要帮我父母的忙，我的孩子的忙，不是因为他们觉得他们工作是他们最基本的需要，对不对？ This is the problem. So workers are alienated not just from their capacity for creative work, but from the work process. They're also alienated from the product, 产品. If I have the capacity for creative work, and work is my prime want, and I create a work of beauty, like an artist who creates a painting, or a scientist who devises a new theory, or an architect who builds a beautiful building, I regard that product as my own, as something that expresses my identity and my human essence, right? But most workers in capitalist societies don't think that way, right? If I'm working in a factory and I just do one repetitive thing, and then at the end of a factory line, there's a product like a refrigerator, 冰箱, 我不会觉得哇这个冰箱是我的东西, People are alienated from the work product because they don't own the means of production, 生产资料, that allow them to develop their capacity for creative work. So this is a very serious criticism of capitalism. Finally, in capitalist societies, most workers are alienated from fellow workers, 他们的同事. Why? Because we regard workers as competing for the same job. They're competitors, not friendly, cooperative people who are engaged in a joint project. If I'm in a factory, and we are competing for the same job, he wants a higher salary than me, I want a higher salary than him, we're alienated from each other. 我们被异化. We're alienated from each other. We're not friends, we're competitors. In a communist society, we would be working together to create a work of beauty that expresses our capacity for creative work. This is why capitalism is so bad, okay? We have to move on to a society that allows us to express our capacity for creative work, that regards work as something meaningful, that we identify with the product of the work, and we regard the workers as fellow human creative beings who together work for a better future, okay? Even worse, Marx, he was not a romantic. He did not say we should go back to 他当然反对封建社会，对不对? He opposes pre-capitalist societies, but at least in one way, pre-capitalist societies were better than capitalism, because at least in pre-capitalist societies, for example, if I'm a shoemaker, I make the shoe, I design the shoe, I'm in charge of the whole process. It's very slow, very inefficient, and it won't be a rich society, but at least I can identify with the product, with the shoe, and I'm not so competitive with other people. And to a certain extent, I can express my creativity in work. Capitalism makes it worse. Capitalism makes work very hierarchical. 这些等级是非常清楚, right? Especially the hierarchy between the capitalists who own the means of production, right? 生产资料, and the workers who own nothing but their own bodies. There's a clear hierarchy between capitalists and workers. And within the factory, there's also very rigid division of labor, where people do only one thing usually, and it becomes even more alienating than under pre-capitalist society. Okay? So this is the big problem with capitalism. One big problem is that workers are alienated. The first problem is false consciousness, 虚假意识. third problem, of course, workers are exploited, right? 劳动者被剥削，这个削还是削？削 ，OK， 第一项被剥削。What does that mean? Well, this is Karl Marx's theory of surplus value. 剩余价值 basically, it's like this, okay? If I work in a factory for 12 hours, if there's no exploitation, I should get the value of 12 hours of work because it's my work, right? But in reality, in a capitalist society, let's pretend he is the capitalist. He owns the means of production. I work for you. You give me a salary. But the salary, of course, is less than 12 hours of work, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't hire me. He takes, let's say, 6 hours of my work, or 8 hours, or even 10. He exploits me. It's that simple, okay? So workers in capitalist societies have false consciousness a lot of time. They're alienated and they're exploited. That's what's wrong with capitalism. That's why we have to, destroy capitalism and move on to a communist society, which will overcome these problems of false consciousness, alienation, and exploitation. Okay? Now, we have to ask, 是不是正义的问题，或者非正义的问题 or is it a scientific problem, 科学的问题? Karl Marx had a theory of history, and he thought it was a theory that is scientific, that is necessary. He thought communism was necessary, 是必须的。一方面是我们的目标，另一方面是必须的。It's a necessary outcome of history. Okay? We have here feudalism, moving on to capitalism, and then moving on to communism. Okay? And communism, there's two forms. First is lower, 低级共产主义. And then the last one is higher communism, 高级共产主义. Okay? If you criticize capitalism in here, there's no point. You can only criticize capitalism here when the revolution is about to happen. When the conditions are ready for the revolution, that's when we need to engage in moral criticism. Why? Karl Marx said it here. Because we need to set free the elements of the new society. New society is communism, with which the old is pregnant. Capitalism, 好像 capitalism 怀孕, you know? 什么意思? It's more like capitalism has a kind of monster in the stomach. The monster is from the capitalist viewpoint, it's a monster. When the capitalism is pregnant, so to speak, with a monster, that's when we can criticize capitalism when it's about to give birth. And then we can bring about communism. The monster will come out and be a beautiful communist baby. Why? Why do we bother if it's a necessary process to shorten and lessen its birth pangs, to lessen the suffering of workers? If communism is about to be brought about, and Karl Marx in his own day thought communism was very close, we need to criticize capitalism to reduce the suffering of workers. That's the moral point. And to bring about a communist society. That's the moral point. But we have to ask, when is capitalism pregnant with communism, so to speak? Do some of you have studied a little bit of Karl Marx's theory of history? 什么时候资本主义会导致共产主义？而且为什么有共产主义的革命？按照马克思的理论 what are the conditions for capitalism to lead to communism? You studied a little bit of Karl Marx, right? When does that happen? When? 什么时候？你们学过一些马克思历史理论，对不对？按照马克思的历史理论，什么时候有共产主义的革命？ It has to be certain conditions in place. What are those conditions in place? Is it a poor society or a rich society? 是落后的国家还是比较富裕的国家？什么？啊？
就是说，在资本主义高度发展的几个国家同时发生。
对，为什么？
也就是说，要实现社会主义，是通过在几个高度发达的资本主义国家同时进行才有可能发生的。因为他的观点就是，我觉得他是用他的一种唯物史的观点去看待问题。他觉得历史的发展是往前的，资本主义还处在一个上升期，就是只有当物质财富积累到一定程度时，才有可能。
对，是的。It has to be a relatively wealthy society, to use Karl Marx's language, with highly developed productive forces. 生产力什么？为什么？ Because if you want workers to be freed from alienated work and from exploitation, they have to have the material basis that allows them to be creative. And capitalism is bad, but it has one virtue. 按照马克思的理论，为什么资本主义的优点是什么？他为什么觉得包括印度啊、中国这些国家都需要资本主义？为什么 ？What is 资本主义的最大的优点是什么？按照马克思的理论。Remember, it has to be a rich society, 比较富裕的国家 developed productive forces, right? 发展的生产力 right? Why does capitalism help to bring that outcome? 为什么资本主义是必须的手段？可以这么说，为什么？封建的社会会不会导致这样的富裕的国家呢？会还是不会？不会。为什么？为什么资本主义会有这样的结果呢？为什么？按照马克思的理论。Okay, let's put it this way. 我们俩是资本家，我怎么赚钱呢？我怎么比他多赚钱呢？啊？
资本主义的竞争逻辑使得它创造它的生产力不断的提高效率，从而创造了比以往的社会要多的资源和财富。
对 exactly. Capitalists have to compete with each other to make a profit. The only way to do that is to develop better technology that makes my factory more efficient. China is like this now, right? China is moving from a relatively undeveloped, low technology society that depends on capitalist 19th century style factories to upgrading, becoming better factories with better technology. Only capitalism forces the owners of the means of production to compete with each other so that they make more money, and the only way to do that is by improving efficiency. 提高我的效率，我怎么提高我的效率呢？ Better technology, better means of production, better ability to use those means of production. So capitalism, the virtue of capitalism is that it makes the overall society wealthier, right? Better technology and more wealth in all of society. But of course, the problem is that only a tiny minority of people, the capitalists, control this money in the society. That's why we need a revolution. Take away, expropriate the capitalists, 剥削资本家, and then distribute the means of production to all the workers. And then we can all be free to develop our capacity for creative work. That's the dream. 这是马克思的梦想, okay? 很清楚, okay? You have to expropriate the capitalists, distribute the means of production, 资料, to everybody, all the workers, so that we can all be free to develop our capacity for creative work. Then we could be free to collaborate, to build a building that's beautiful. You could be free to write a book. You could be free to paint a painting, and so on, okay? That's the dream of Marxism. And if capitalism is pregnant, 怀孕, 当然是比喻, 对不对? Meaning that capitalism brings about a society that is wealthy with a lot of resources. That's the time for revolution. That's when you have to engage in moral criticism, 批评资本主义, and then free the workers of suffering, make the revolution happen faster to reduce the suffering of workers, okay? So on the one hand, he says it's a scientific theory, 是客观的, 是必须的历史过程. On the other hand, there is a moral role to play in criticizing capitalism when the conditions are right for revolution so that we can reduce the suffering of workers. Okay? That's the idea. Okay? So what happens after the revolution? Well, first we have lower communism. 低级共产主义，低级共产主义不是最理想的共产主义，最理想的共产主义是高级共产主义。低级共产主义是什么呢？怎么分配资源呢？ How to distribute resources in lower communism. In capitalism, 怎么分配资源？就是资本家控制资源，所以他们说了算。高级共产主义没有资本家，但是还不是最发展的国家，而且还是有一些虚假的意识 ，still some false consciousness， 不可以马上从资本主义导致高级共产主义的社会，需要一些过程。先是低级共产主义，低级共产主义怎么分配资源呢？很清楚，我估计这个你们都学过，对不对？是吗？学过吗？各尽所能，按劳分配。按劳分配什么意思呢？ Whatever I work for, I get in return. If I work for 12 hours, I get 12 hours worth of work. So in a capitalist society, people tend to think I work and what I get from work is what I deserve. In fact, it's not true, right? He's a capitalist. He takes some of my work product, some of my salary. In lower communism, I deserve everything that I work for. I work hard for 12 hours in the field, I get 12 hours worth of product. If he works 8 hours in a field, he gets 8 hours of product. The means of production are communally owned. He doesn't have more means of production than me, right? 这些生产资料大家都是平等这方面。所以 if we have the same instruments, he works 8 hours, I work 12 hours, I get 4 hours worth more of product or money than he does. It's a kind of meritocracy, 能力主义. Those who work hard get more in return. That's the myth in capitalism. In capitalism, wow, if I work hard, I get more in return. In fact, the reality is those who own capital get more. It doesn't have that much to do with hard work. But in lower communism, the capitalist myth becomes a reality. Those who work hard get more in return. There's no false consciousness. 没有虚假意识，大家都知道，大家都很清楚。如果我很努力，那我可以多赚钱。Okay? The rhetoric is a reality. 意思是说，理想与现实没有什么区别。Okay? 没有什么差距。No exploitation, because 没有资本家，资本家不可以剥削劳动者，对不对？ So if I work hard, I get 12 hours of work. It sounds good, right? 理论上，表面上是不错的制度，对不对？但是有什么问题？道德方面有什么问题？为什么低级工厂主义不如高级工厂主义呢？有人知道吗？马克思很清楚，而且会直接影响罗尔斯。OK， 我们看 ，This is a very famous, hugely influential, very, very important passage in the last major work that Karl Marx wrote. 我希望大家都看了嘛。In English, is Critique of the Gotha Program. 中文是 OK， 我们都发给大家。如果你们今天没看，下次我们要讨论问题，你们一定要看。OK。Marx says, lower communism 低级工厂主义不是很理想的分配制度的分配资源的制度。当然比资本主义好，但是不如高级工厂主义。为什么呢？ He says here, some people have greater natural talent. So this equal right to get work meaning that, equal right meaning 按劳分配，表面上是平等的，但是不是平等的。为什么呢？ Because it becomes an unequal right for unequal labor. It, meaning 低级工厂主义 lower communism, recognizes no class differences. Okay, 这个不是个问题。Because everyone is only a worker like everybody else. No classes. Okay, 大家都平等这方面。But it tacitly 是默认 recognizes unequal individual endowment and thus productive capacity as natural privileges. 你们可以看中文表是不是很清楚？其实没有那么复杂，是这样的 OK。如果他比我聪明，他肌肉比我多，如果我们资源方面没有什么区别，但是我努力12个小时，他努力12个小时，谁会多赚钱？肯定是他，对不对？但是他比我聪明， 为什么这个是公平的吗？他为什么那么聪明？可能是因为他就出生的时候比我聪明，就是因为他都应该赚钱呢？不公平 ，right? It's unfair. We should not get rewarded on the basis of undeserved natural endowments like intelligence or physical strength. Okay? That's it makes 你明白吗？不是因为我没有那么聪明，所以我不应该多赚钱，这个是非常不公平，对不对？为什么我不聪明？就是因为我笨，我出生的时候我笨，所以就是因为我笨，所以我不应该我不应该多赚钱呢？很不公平，对不对？ Even if the lower communism, the resources are equally distributed, but if some people, because they're born more smart or born stronger, they will get more contribution in return. 如果是这样的安老分配，比较聪明的人，比较可以说肌肉比较多的人，他们会比较成功。这个是完全是不公平的。It's unfair. That's the problem, okay? John Rawls will make this central insight for his own theory, okay? And also, 也有一些异化 there's still alienation. 因为为什么这么努力呢？因为我都可以赚钱，对不对？ He's smarter than me. He works hard because he wants more money. We're not working. Life 理论上劳动应该是生活的第一个需要，而不是手段。如果我工作的目标还是为了赚钱，我还是异化。I'm still alienated because I work because I have to work to make money, not because work is something that I want to do. Okay? So it's not life's prime want. 高级工厂主义，当然，高级工厂主义，劳动是生活的第一个需要，我们还没有达到高级工厂主义。所以慢慢来，我们可以从低级工厂主义，然后慢慢来，社会会变成高级工厂主义。最重要的、最大的区别是什么呢？这个高级工厂主义还是最富裕的社会。如果是最富裕的社会，我不需要为了赚钱工作。OK？ 高级工厂主义怎么分配资源呢？这个你们都学过，对不对？按需分配，按照需要分配，不是因为我聪明，或者不是因为我比较努力，或者不是因为当然不是因为我的资本多或者我的资源多。怎么分配资源？就是如果你的需要比我多，那国家或者我们都会分给你资源。It's a beautiful idea. 这是高级工厂主义，是最平等的社会 ，OK？ 因为那时候没有，不是因为有的人比较聪明，所以他们都赚钱，没有这样的情况。怎么分配资源？按照需要。如果我是残疾人 都给我一些资源，因为这是我的需要，对不对？跟我聪明不聪明没有什么关系。There is no exploitation， 没有剥削，大家都平等，大家工作的目标很清楚，就是因为我喜欢工作，因为工作的过程我可以发展 我可以考虑一些创造性的东西，然后我可以发展。 我的工作是我的第一个需要，当然没有异化 ，no alienation. The reason that I work is to exercise my creative power. The work process is something that I identify with. I work because I want to work, not because it's a means to life. I identify with the products of my work, right? 如果我是 作家，我写书，这书是我的书 okay? And we have cooperative and harmonious relations with other workers. 我们要一起工作，我们都是比较和谐的关系 okay? 其实我们上次讨论和谐指标，我们也可以看工人的和谐也很重要，对不对？但是怎么测量也是一个问题。So 这是现在你们明白低级共产主义和高级共产主义的区别是什么？有没有问题这方面？你们明白为什么高级共产主义按照马克思的理论比低级共产主义是比较公平的制度？为什么？最重要的原因是什么？你们说为什么？为什么高级共产主义比低级共产主义好？
就是因为那个高级共产主义，它按需分配的这种条件下，它能就是尽可能的排除掉因为天赋不一样而带来的不平等。
对，天赋不一样，这是最大的区别。不是因为天赋不一样，所以我们不应该影响分配资源 ，OK？ 但是低级共产主义天赋不一样，还会影响怎么分配资源 ，OK？ 高级共产主义会解决这个问题。高级共产主义是按照需要来分配资源，跟天赋没有什么关系 ，OK？ This is very important, and it has direct influence on John Rawls.